I have read, early on reading about, I don't know how many books I've read about Abraham Lincoln or the Roosevelts or Gandhi or someone no one's ever heard of. If they did that, then, there's a lot of horrible people in the world. If they're capable of that, then human beings are capable of being that good, that great. I haven't done, great things yet, but, maybe someday, I do a little bit of good here and there, and then, hopefully somebody passes it on.
Welcome to AudioLife Memoirs, the podcast where we share your story in your voice. I'm your host today, Carrie Purcell, co-founder at AudioLife Memoirs. And today I'm joined by Jules Delorme, an author who's recently published his memoir, I Heard a Crow Before I Was Born. I'll try to frame this for you properly. So if you're joining us on YouTube, you can see the cover here. Otherwise, we will have links to the book in our show notes. And this is actually Jules' third book. In it, he talks about his childhood in his Mohawk community on a reserve near Cornwall, Ontario. He talks about family and friends, both two-legged and four-legged friends who have impacted his life and stayed with him. He talks about the residual abuse and anger left from the residential school system his ancestors were subjected to, anger, violence, and abuse within his family and community, not fitting in on or off the reserve. He also talks about forgiveness and so much more. Jules, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And if you've listened to our podcast before, we like to go back to the very beginning and often start with a question like I will today. So my first question for you is, where were you born, and is there a story behind your name?
Well, I was born in Toronto by accident. I was literally born in a barn. My mother was, out feeding the pigs. She was, friends of the family. And it was kind of funny because, my mother was, she liked to say, close the door, were you born in a barn? And I would turn and say, yes. I also love to say that I was born in a barn just like Jesus.
Yes, I like that.
So she went into labor and she gave birth right in the barn. Then I was, then they rushed her to Toronto General. But I was born among pigs, which, is, for many people maybe an insult. But, I'm very proud of that because pigs are awesome. And I was named after an uncle, my Uncle Jules, who I only met once. And in actual fact, because my grandfather was a fanatic Catholic, on my birth certificate, my name is Jules twice. So I don't know if, well, you probably know, being, spending time in Quebec, that, Catholics, have very, very long birth certificates. So my name is Jules Fernand, et cetera, because he was also my godfather, even though I only met him once, because he was smart enough to get away from the family, and I respected that. And they misspelled my third name, Fernand, which I'm very happy with. I mentioned that in the book because my grandfather, the fanatic Catholic, was passing on a lot of the abuse that he probably learned in the residential school system and from the Catholic Church. So, was not a man that I liked very much.
And you do talk about that in the book, and that though you were to be named after him, somewhere along the way they misspelled it by one letter, so it isn't his name.
Yeah. So I'm, it's just, instead of Fernand, it's Fernand.
Yeah.
Which, At least I'm lucky enough to not have to carry his name around.
And then your last name, so where did that come from? Do you know the story?
I don't actually know the actual story. I don't know where they decided to, it is not uncommon for among Mohawks to have taken a name for, white, particularly the priest's name, or, someone, Catholic's name. I do know that on Akwesasne there are 2 Delorme roads. So I don't know if it was my grandfather or well before him that we first changed our name, and I don't know what our original name was. So, I don't know where that started. My grandfather would not talk about history.
Yeah.
That's, is unfortunate because, there's this closed offness.
Yeah.
Which a lot of Native Indigenous people know about. That they run into, if their grandparents, their parents went to residential schools, they're not willing to talk about.
Yeah. And whether it's blocking out an experience they don't want to share, trying to protect future generations, some other reason, you can understand the decision, but it's difficult when future generations have lost part of their family history, right? And have those gaps that they can't put into place or put into order.
Yeah, there's a kind of shame that is being passed on. I remember when, I first came across that line by Faulkner about, it's like a ripple in a pond where someone has dropped a pebble and, the ripples pass on, and you weren't even there when the pebble was dropped.
Yes.
But the ripples still touch you.
Yes.
And the shame keeps getting passed on and passed on and passed on. And you don't even know why. You don't even know why you're ashamed.
Yeah.
But you are ashamed. I don't even know if my grandfather, I know he was, ashamed of being, Mohawk. I know he was ashamed of being Native, but, there was also, the shame of what he did.
Yeah, which you allude to in the book. You don't go into a lot of detail. It sounds like some of it is you're intuiting what's happening, but you may not know everything that happened in the past.
Well, see, that's the thing is, because there's so much silence, I don't know exactly what he did.
Yeah.
What I know is, what I talk about in the book is that what I know is that when my grandfather walked into a room, whether it was my aunts or my uncles, they got up and walked out.
Yeah.
And what he did, I don't know exactly. I felt it was very bad, and I feel it was sexual.
Yeah.
My father, I know that, thinking back and, that it was definitely sexual, and that, because he seemed obsessed with, the idea of manhood, and that, he passed that, was anything way I behaved, that what his idea of manhood, he took it out on me. That, I had to be, fit his idea of manhood because, it's hard to put into words. It's just, he was so angry and obsessed with, you had to be a man.
And did you know, his idea of manhood? Did you know what you were supposed to be? And was it something you tried to do?
Well, because of, I have Asperger's, so, I didn't even know as a child. I don't think I understood that he wanted, because, I was just weird. I was a strange child. And for him, that was shameful.
Right.
I could fight, from the time I was very little, I could fight. And, part of the reason I could fight was, because he beat me up from so little that, facing, children my own size was, nothing.
Yeah.
Because, their little fists were nothing compared to his big fists. But that wasn't enough to him. Being strange was, a horror to him because, that was a reflection of him.
Right.
And I couldn't help being strange.
Oh, of course.
And yet my dada, my grandmother, me being strange was this wonderful thing because me, being strange to her meant that I was special. Being strange to her was that I could, understand, that I had medicine, that I could see into other worlds.
Yes.
That's why she was a medicine woman.
Yeah.
That's, at least I had that gift, that she was there to see the strangeness as something good.
Yes. Yeah, it's quite beautiful when you talk about your grandmother and also that specific role where from her tradition and understanding and point of view, you were special and she was able to let you know that and give you a place that felt safe. And it sounds like she taught you a lot. It also sounds like she did teach you, you make a reference to, for example, some mannerisms. So she was one of the people who, would work with you to identify things like making eye contact. Tell me about that. So she saw you as being special. She knew that there were maybe some differences from, people like your father. So what was this part about her kind of working with you to help you understand different ways of communication?
Yeah, it wasn't just her. There was an older boy, and I speak about him in the book, Roger, who, he befriended me largely because of her. Because, she wasn't just a medicine woman, she was also a clan mother. And in Mohawk tradition, that meant she was a very, very important person.
Yeah.
So he befriended me to get close to her.
Okay.
But he took on this role of teaching me. He taught me, how to hunt and how to, things like that, how to track and, stuff like that. But he also taught me how to behave, with the Asperger's, things like eye contact. She did as well. That, at least pretend to be normal. That because it was going to be difficult for me to be in the world. So that, she would say things like, okay, when she was talking to me, she would say, I know it's not easy for you to make eye contact, but, when I'm talking to you, just look at me for a second.
I see. Yeah.
And, I know you don't want to, but just look at me. It took a long time for that to sink in, but I don't think I would have, the world was a little easier for me in the long run, especially once, my mother and my stepfather moved to Toronto and they took me to Toronto and, I was living in the projects and, I don't think I would have, it's not like I made a lot of friends, but I don't think I would have managed as well if they had not taught me that.
Right.
Because I got to, at least fake my way into the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not just, there are certain things there's certain ways that of being in the world where I go, it's almost like, this is very, it's a very indigenous thing, but it's like, I can feel them standing there, telling me, look up.
Yes. Yeah.
Because, if you're, with Asperger's, especially me, my habit is look down.
Yeah.
You're just seeing it now. Look down, look down, look down. Because when I think, I look down, feeling them there is, almost like I'm never alone.
Yeah.
I feel that they're, because Roger, died as well.
Yeah.
And, feeling them there, like they're always with me.
Yeah. And I want to some degree, I want us to go through a chronological version of your story so that people who maybe haven't read your book yet can get a sense of what's in there, also some things that aren't in there. But I'll pick up on just one point. You mentioned, you talked about Roger, who was a significant figure in your life, a friend who you've already mentioned supported you in different ways, taught you different things. And you've also mentioned that he's already passed on. It's quite a story how that happened as well. Is that something that you can share with us?
How he
died?
Well, yeah. So Roger he had moved down to Arizona. He was living on a reservation. I had gone to live with him. I lived with him down there for a couple of years. Most beautiful place. And, in theory, it's by Salt River. In theory, it's supposed to be a Navajo reservation. But, there's part of it where the Apache have just shown up and said, this is ours.
Okay.
And we spent a lot of time with the Apache. Anyway, so Roger was living there, and he was, very much into animals and, living on the land. And he was living with this girl, and she called me up and she said, Roger's gone. I can't find him. I don't know what happened. And I just felt, well, I knew. And I said, go to the barn. He had horses. Are the horses there? And call me back. And she went to the barn, I guess. And she called me back and she said, the horses are gone. And I said, he's dead. And because we had talked often, because growing up on Akwesasne, we were, Akwesasne is on, it's a weird place because it's on the border between Canada and the United States. And we lived on the island, which, so the St. Lawrence goes on both sides of it. When I was growing up, we had DuPont dumping chemicals into the river. It was the seaway, so there were ships coming through dumping their chemicals. And we also had Colgate on the American side dumping fluoride into the water. And, fluoride is, you generally think good, but fluoride, turns out that a lot of fluoride can make you quite sick.
Yeah. So
the reason I've lived as long as I have is I don't eat fish. I hate fish. But most of the people who lived on the island, almost nobody that I grew up with has lived as long as I have. They've either died of mercury poisoning from the DuPont plant, or they've died of, the fluoride because, they get blockages, or they get really sick from the fluoride and cancers.
Yeah.
And Roger had said, if I get cancer or I get, the mercury causes the Mad Hatter's disease, where you start twitching. I've got a little bit of it. My hands twitch, my eyes twitch. And he said, if I ever get it, I'm going to go find a bear and let the bear take me. I don't want to be buried. I don't want, that's, it's an honor to be taken by a bear.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to make the bear fight for it. And it took a while, but they found his truck up in the Rocky Mountains. He was one of the best trackers I've ever known, but I guarantee you, he found himself, he was a grizzly.
Yeah.
And gave himself to that bear. And, he put up a fight. I guarantee you.
Yeah.
That bear had to earn his meal.
Wow.
And now for a word from our sponsors. Ready to share your stories and life philosophy? Or capture those of a parent or grandparent? Or maybe a corporate package is right for you to build connection across your workforce and add value to your clients. Visit audiolife.io today to learn more. Our listeners will get 10% off using discount code GIFT10 and order number AudioLife Podcast. AudioLife, where memories find their voice.
It's quite a way to go. It's quite a story.
And by the way, we're Bear Clan, so that's why we,
yeah,
give ourselves to the bear.
Yeah. So throughout your book, you devote many, not all, but most chapters to a person in your life. So we do have that chapter where we learn about Roger. We learn a lot about family. Can you share, for people who maybe haven't read the book yet, can you share a little bit about what family life was like?
Well, from an outside perspective, it probably, it was difficult to write the book because from an outside perspective, it was, even from my perspective at the time, it was hell. It was, even the events in the book are just a small part of the horror that, I lived through. But there was, I don't know who it was who said this, but it's the darker it gets, the more you see the stars.
Mm-hmm.
And there was love. There was Roger. There was my grandmother. There was something that kept me alive, gave me a reason to not to go to the dark side.
Yeah.
Because many people around me did.
Yes.
Because I could look at, especially growing up on with the first 12 years of my life on that res. So, looking around, many kids had it worse.
Yeah.
Than I did. And, even in the projects, many kids had it worse.
Yeah.
And, many of them didn't survive.
Yeah.
And I survived. And I think it was, I had little, and not even just Roger and my grandmother. There were teachers, there were, friends, there were, little, but I had to know and, and recognize those as, people that I could hang on to, or the people I could reach out to, and, and know them for what they were.
Mm-hmm.
And not even just, people that I met, but just, from very early on, I started reading. And, I have, I have never been one of those people who, I've met people who said they have no heroes. I have thousands of heroes.
Yeah.
Because And I'm not just saying that because of this podcast. I am saying reading memoirs, reading about people, has inspired me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have read, early on reading about, someone like, I don't know how many books I've read about Abraham Lincoln or the Roosevelts or Gandhi or, or someone no one's ever heard of.
Yeah.
If they did that, then, there's a lot of horrible people in the world. If they're capable of that, then human beings are capable of being that good.
Yes.
That great. I haven't done, great things yet, but, maybe someday, I do a little bit of good here and there, and then, hopefully somebody passes it on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some horrible things were done to me, but that doesn't mean, some good things were done as well.
Yeah.
And hopefully that comes out in the book that, there were good. There was good.
Yeah, I think it does come out. And I don't think, I believe you when you say it was difficult to write parts of this book. I think some of the reviews use words like heavy, right? There's some really heavy content. There is abuse and there is violence, and there's violence in the home and out of the home and within the communities that you lived in. We don't need to relive. You've gone through the work of putting that into words and publishing it in the book, and we don't need to relive some of those stories in this podcast. But there's a lot of gratitude for some of those really special people in your life, and I know there are some that you've already mentioned that aren't in the book. There's a lot of forgiveness. There's a lot of using I think we'll talk about this as we talk about your education and your work, but the turning the violence, that education, that really, really intimate knowledge that you had of detecting violence, of experiencing violence, of being good at being violent, you turned it into actually a way of detecting and diffusing violence before it happened in some of your work, and in some of your, so there, all of those are really incredible good things that came out of your experience that you were able to harness into good. So maybe so let's kind of move into getting into education and career. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you were around 16 when you, and I think you were maybe too young for the Army, but you somehow managed to have ID or have something to convince them you were a little bit older. Is that right?
Yeah, I had a teacher, who got me forged ID. Yeah, I don't name her because, she broke the law. And she got me forged ID because the only way I was going to survive was to get into the Army.
Okay.
Things were going very bad at home, and I wasn't going to make it through school. She got me forged ID. I got into the Army. A whole bunch of people, smarter than me went into the Army and learned a trade. I learned how to jump out of planes and kill people. But I also, finished school, and, they paid for my way through university. And in doing that, I was actually in the airborne regiment that I was out by the time they got in all that trouble in Somalia. But I knew a lot of the people that did it. It was pretty insane. It was there was a lot of insanity going on in the Army back then, a lot of racism, but it was, it didn't feel like racism at the time. We had, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. It was racism and homophobia, but it was, it was just what happened. Anyway, so I got out, I decided I had enough because I would pretend that I was just one of the guys,
Yeah.
But, I just went along and I got out. I had signed up for 5 years. And after 3 years, well, close to 3 years, I actually went to my commanding officer and showed him my real ID.
Wow.
And so I got an honorable discharge because they didn't want an embarrassment.
Right.
And they paid my way through university.
Right. Wow. When you say that there was racism, and we haven't said this yet on the podcast, we've talked about your Indigenous heritage, but we haven't talked about your mother's side of the family yet. So your mother is white.
Yeah.
So you're half Native and you're half white. When you say there was racism in the Army, was any of that directed toward the Native community? And if so, were you seen as Native or were you seen as white?
Oh, absolutely. They used to, my master corporal, when I was going through basic training, would call me wagon burner. But it was just seen as funny at the time. It was so common at the time that I never took it personally. I never, felt it. I never got angry about it. It was just my stepfather would use terms like that, and I don't think my stepfather never ever meant it the way it was the generation he was brought up in, because he didn't mean, and my stepfather, he really was a racist, but he didn't hate me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you use the term in the book about another situation. You say that you and your sister, let me find the quote. You use the term imitation. You say, my sister Debbie and I became lesser monsters in that we were just imitations, facsimiles of the real thing. I wonder if that's part of what you're getting at, is that they were just repeating something that they had heard, but there wasn't whatever that deep motivation that is not kind-hearted, that has the cruelty behind it. Maybe that wasn't there as much as this is just. You also say in the book, you use the term Indian very, very frequently because that's the term that was used. And you say that very clearly. This is what we said at that time. I wonder if that's part of the spirit behind it, is it doesn't carry necessarily a cruel meaning behind it to the person using it. They're just imitating something that did have a cruel meaning behind it. Is that part of it, or am I taking it too far?
It's just, it's a reflection of a reflection of a reflection.
Yeah.
And that, they're not even thinking about what they're saying.
Yeah.
And, so there's no cruel intention behind it.
Yeah.
And yet we've reached a point where, society as a whole has to stop. But, when I say that my father had no cruel intention, that doesn't mean that society, didn't create these words that were wrong.
Yes.
I had a best friend, because I could fight, all the rejects would gather around me because I was a weird kid. And so I was a reject. It was a strange situation because, when you're a kid, if you could fight, you were supposed to be cool. But I was weird. So all the kids that were rejects would gather around me. So I had a friend, Tommy Hum, who was Chinese, and they would, they would sing to him, "Chicky Chicky Chinaman," and Tommy never got angry about it because it was just, like I said, a reflection of a reflection of a reflection.
Yeah.
He never even thought about it. I would get angry for Tommy.
Yeah.
That they were calling him that. But Tommy never ever got angry. And yet, like I said, I would go, like my blood father, who, was obviously did horrible things to me, he would take me, back then you could, he would take me into the city because, there weren't bars on the reserve. It was a dry reserve. So he would take me into the city, and literally on the bars, there would be a sign that said no dogs or Indians.
Wow.
But he would go in because he wanted to drink. And it would be, I would stand outside, and it would be like, maybe 5-10 minutes before he would come out bloody.
Oh my gosh.
And then he would go to the next bar. And that's just the way it was. That's just the way it was. It was like, it was... I didn't know it was supposed to be any way else.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
There was a movie theater in Cornwall, the city, which was directly across the river from Akwesasne. And at one point, it was the Roxy Theater, which my stepfather helped build. And the Roxy Theater, played, low budget films.
Okay.
And, at one point it had the film Billy Jack, which was, a white guy playing an Indian. But what was spectacular for us was it was an Indian beating up a bunch of white people. And that theater was filled with Indians. Because it was the first time we'd ever seen that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was, and that was the first time I'd ever experienced that was possible. And I was horrified. I don't think maybe 15, 16 when I realized that the actor was white.
Yeah.
It was, it was just, part of our world. And yet, my mother, because, in Cornwall, my mother denied her Frenchness. We weren't allowed to speak French in the house. She would beat us if we spoke French. Because French were there, they would use the N-word to refer to French people. They would call them pea soup N-word in Cornwall because half of that city was French. It was because it's close to the Quebec border. So the only thing lower than a French person was an Indian, and I was both.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is my mother had two Indigenous children, and she hated Indians. I mean, she really hated Indians.
So you're talking about you and your sister Debbie. So how did she meet Jack, your birth father, if she was very racist? Yeah.
Well, she had moved to Toronto. Her family had moved to Toronto. They were living in Christie Pets. And, my stepfather told me this story that they were living in like a hovel. He described it, that just horrible. Cat poo everywhere. And my blood father, Jack, was very handsome. Extremely handsome. Tall, good looking. And he came to Toronto. He was part of a criminal. See, in Akwesasne, they were, because it's on the American border, it was, you could make a lot of money smuggling.
Okay. Yep.
When I was a kid, I made money, smuggling cigarettes over the border on my sled. I was 5 and 6 years old.
Wow.
And, the adults made a lot of money doing it, with booze, cigarettes.
Okay.
So Jack went to Toronto and, wanted to be, kind of raise himself up in the world. And there were a lot of gangs in Toronto at the time. And, Christie Pitts was, where a lot of the gangs were. Somewhere along the line, so he met my mother. And he was actually after my mother's sister, who was very good looking. But he ended up with my mother. At the time, though, he had also befriended my stepfather, who, because my stepfather's brother was very high up in a gang.
Okay.
And he wanted to be, get close to my stepfather's brother. And my stepfather was very interested in my mother. But my blood father was better looking. So she ended up with my blood father. So they went back to Cornwall. She refused to move on to the reserve with him.
Okay.
So they got a house on Water Street, which was right across the water from the reserve. Well, they got an apartment. And he would go back and forth between the reserve and her. When she got pregnant, he started to get violent. And for some reason, when she got pregnant with me, which I was the second one, he got really violent.
Yeah.
When she was late in the pregnancy with me, he went to prison. And he asked my stepfather to watch out for her. Basically, make sure she didn't mess around with anybody. And when my stepfather first, went to check on her in Water Street, she was so badly beat up that she was barely recognizable. So, he spent time in Water Street nursing her, fell in love with her, and decided that she could not go back to Jack. And that's the story of how they ended up together. They never actually got married. I always thought they did. But it turned out that at the time it was fine with Jack because Jack had another family in Toronto. And he was, he was just such an a-hole that, he had already gotten that woman pregnant, and he had named the kid, the daughter that she had, Julie. He couldn't even come up with a new name.
Yeah. Stay tuned for part 2 of my conversation with Jules Delorme, author of I Heard the Crow Before I Was Born.
If you like what you heard today, consider recording your own AudioLife private podcast or giving one to a loved one for a unique and memorable gift. Today, AudioLife listeners will receive 10% off using discount code GIFT10 and order number AudioLife Podcast. Also, remember to rate our show and subscribe so you'll never miss an episode.